Massimo Leone is full professor at the University of Turin in philosophy of communication and is a part-time professor of semiotics at Shanghai University in the Department of Chinese Language and Literature, and is a world-renowned specialist in visual semiotics, cultural semiotics, and religious studies. He is the director of the prestigious Center for Religious Studies, the Fondazione Bruno Kessler. It's really difficult to give an overview of his career as it is so rich and long. I can mention all his books. I'm always making a small selection so that you can get an idea of the variety of themes Massimo has dealt with. He's the author of Religious Conversion and Identity, the Semiotic Analysis of Text, Routledge 2004, Saint and Signs, a semiotic reading of conversion in early modern Catholicism, de Gruyter 2010, Sémiotique de l'âme, langage du changement spirituel à l'aube de l'âge moderne, presse académique francophone, Annunciazioni, percorsi di semiotica della religione, Arachne 2014, Spiritualità digitale, il senso religioso nell'era della smaterializzazione, Mimesis 2014, and many others. He has long been the editor of the important Italian journal Lexia, of the book collection I Saggi di Lexia, of the collection Semiotics of Religion for Walter de Gruyter. Recently, he has been elected as co-director of the prestigious journal Semiotica and director of a new book collection that he has just launched at Routledge on the cultures of the faith. He has been visiting professor or visiting scholar at several universities around the world, including the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, Trinity College in Dublin, the École Française in Rome, the University of Fribourg, the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, Melbourne, Toronto, Berlin, Sorbonne, Kyoto, Durham, Warsaw, Frias, Fribourg Institute of Advanced Studies. The Face in Digital Studies is the topic of his ERC Consolidator grant entitled Face Aesthetics in Contemporary E-Technological Societies, which runs from 2019 to 2024 and has enabled him to recruit a quite big team of promising postdoctoral research, as well as doctoral students working on the relationship between face and artificial intelligence. His talk of today carries forward this ERC project and is entitled The Augmented Face, Digital Mask or Digital Veil.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Enzo, for this very generous presentation. Thank you, Maria Giulia and Enzo, for organizing such a beautiful symposium. I'm really humbled to share the morning with the two very distinguished speakers that have preceded me. I will offer, I would say, a very different perspective, one that I would characterize as a continental, European, Italian, Southern Italian, Catholic, provincial perspective, meaning that we cannot enjoy technology, we have to be guilty about it, you know, and we have also to try to make other people feel guilty about it. So please, don't take me too seriously. So the adjective augmented comes from the Latin augmentum, a derivative of the verb augere or augere, to increase. The root of this verb, aug, which also has an equivalent in the Sanskrit vax, to grow, is found in many Latin lemmas indicating augmentation, often in a metaphorical sense, and in relation to activities that could be called semiotic. It is found, for example, in the Latin word augur, augure in Italiano, augur in Latin, who is the one who causes to grow or emerge from the observed reality, the omnia, the signs of the future. But the same root, aug, it is also found in auctoritas, and thus in auctor, that is, the one who, by producing signs, increases his or her prestige. This paper, which is a formal paper, I'm sorry, I'll also make you suffer through this paper and by this paper, intends to deal precisely with the relationship between augmentum and auctoritas, with some general semiotic considerations, but also with a more circumscribed topic related to them, namely the relationship between augmented reality, and in particular augmented image, and the range of semiotic and epistemic positions related to sign augmentation, namely authorship, authoriality, authority, but also authoritarianism. All four of these discursive regimes derive from semiotic augmentation operations, but with very divergent relational outcomes. This means not only that in order to construct authorship, signs must be added to the world, but it also means that these signs must possess a special character, augmented precisely. In what, for example, are augur signs augmented? And in what ways do they help define the authorship, but also the authoritativeness, this is the most difficult English word I know, authoritativeness and authority of the augur? First, bringing out these signs from reality is not for everyone, but requires technical expertise, where the ordinary Roman citizen simply sees a few birds in flight. The augur identifies what might be called patterns, that is, visual configurations, the result of the motor behavior of a few birds in flight, which the augur indicates is a sign. Today, we know there is no causal relationship between these configurations and the future state of things. Certainly, these flights cause something. For example, they cause the augur's vaticinations, but they do not in any way cause what these vaticinations represent, namely the future. However, the operation of the augur does not consist in identifying causes, as in the case of physicians, but rather in pointing out indexical signs. Through a technical ritual, the augur has the flight of birds in the sky, a natural occurrence, to be seen as indexical of the future. The physician of ancient Rome also did the same. That is, he identified certain features of the sick person's body as indicative signs of his or her illness, except that these signs were also symptoms, that is, underlain by a physical causal relationship. The augur does not identify new causal links in the world, for he does not claim that the flight of birds causes the future, but he guarantees through his own technical ritual discourse that that flight is a sign of the future, an effect caused by it. Here then, in essence, is the difference between the physician or scientist and the augur or author. The former identifies some signs as the effect of a past cause, while the latter identifies some signs as the effect of a future cause. It seems obvious to us today that anyone who identifies signs in the present caused by the future is a waffler. Signs can only be caused by the past is an axiom of scientific thought. There can be signs of causes and not of effects. How then did the augur manage to pass off the flight of birds as a sign caused by the existence in the future of a not yet occurred state of affairs? By resorting to technical knowledge, as noted above, except that such knowledge was not like that of the physician, based on the observation of cause and effect in reality, but rather a knowledge that could be called rhetorical. If the physician's technique identifies in the present the signs caused by the past, the augur's rhetoric identifies in the present the signs caused by the future. This operation is accomplished precisely by presenting rhetoric as a technique, that is, as a doing motivated by the real, where it is, on the contrary, an arbitrary doing in no way motivated by the real. In fact, anyone could exercise the role of the augur, and the signs he identifies could be identified in any other way and endowed with a completely different meaning. The strength of the augur's discourse consists in making people believe that this is not true, that the augur's, in short, is not a rhetoric but a technique which could not be exercised in any other way and especially could not lead to alternative results. That rhetoric should pass itself off as a technique is patently absurd, yet this succeeds for the augur precisely because of the augmented character, so to speak, of his performance. The augur's clothes, his gestures, his words, the whole rituality of his role and function have as their purpose to give the rhetoric of vaticination the value of a technique. Ritual is in fact a discursive regime that, by increasing the sign tenor of communication compared to its non-ritual circulation, gives it an erratic character and, above all, attributes motivation to the arbitrary. But take away the augur's toga, remove him from the altar, change his Latin to a vulgar dialect, do away with his gestures and intonation, and above all, strip him of the label of augur, removed all these augmented signs, there will be nothing left of the rhetoric, hence the inability to present it as a technique. Does that cross flight of a seagull indicate that there will be a storm tomorrow? And who says so? Who are you to claim that? Why that seagull and not that sparrow? And why a storm and not an earthquake? On the contrary, take away the doctor's lab coat, tear off his stethoscope, deprive him of his social recognition as a doctor, when this doctor, without any increased science anymore, this doctor without rhetoric, tells us that a certain spot on our skin is actually a basilioma, we will be the first to thank him not for his rhetoric, but for his technique. The situation is actually more complicated, as in modernity, it is now possible to construct authority not only by adding signs to the current discursive regime, but also by subtracting them. This is an effect of the third element at play besides technique and rhetoric, namely criticism. As criticism debunks the rhetorical character of technique, that is, pseudo-technique, the latter reacts by developing minimalist rhetorics which work by subtraction rather than addition, but this is not the occasion to explore such subtleties. Suffice it to conclude, at the end of this first section, that semiotic augmentation is evidently relational with respect to the discursive community in which it occurs and involves a construction of both authorship and authority. The rhetoric of sign augmentation, however, is not motivated by the real and thus owes its force to an implicit symbolic convention. This causes the signs of augurs of all time to be subject to decay and a kind of sign inflation. After a while, the augur's gestures no longer convince anyone. They're imitated and made the object of caricature and mockery. They cease to convince that indeed in the real there are signs of future states omnia. This decay is dramatically fast in modernity. Signs that are used to lend prestige to a pseudo-technique lose their aura and must be quickly replaced with an overall effect of devaluing the rhetoric of technique in general. In late modernity, then, this inflation produces a paradoxical chiasm between rhetoric and technique. On the one hand, as it is increasingly difficult to construct a pseudo-technical enchantment of rhetoric, the sign augmentation required to achieve that result must be ever greater, and above all, it must increasingly simulate a technical language which essentially relies on two discursive elements. On the one hand, the use of devices, on the other hand, computation. Devices and computations are the means by which any rhetoric that produces indexes can be passed off as a technique that discovers causes. The reason is simple. Since science often uses technique, that is, devices and computation, to discover causes in the world, then simply using these two elements is enough to give the impression that one is doing the same. This chiasmus has the dramatic consequence that these same two elements, i.e. devices and computation, become subject to the same sign inflation that characterizes rhetoric, as pseudoscientific claims appear that purport to arise from the application of devices and computation to reality. All scientific discourse begins to arouse suspicion. In short, we have moved from a situation in which the augur was passing himself off as a doctor to a situation in which the doctor is being passed off as an augur. All of this initial discourse on the epistemology of sign augmentation in relation to science and pseudoscience, rhetoric and pseudo-rhetoric, goes in a direction that one might have already guessed. Academic discourse, and in particular that of the humanities and social sciences, and now the self-flagellation begins, reflects a great deal on the augmented character of science, and especially of images in numerous social spheres, from sentimental relationships to play. It also reflects on the extent to which these augmented images intervene to corroborate the technical character of contemporary scientific discourse. However, it is not always the case that the critique of the humanities and social sciences turns in on itself to observe how often in their own discourse augmented science and augmented images are resorted to precisely for the purpose of corroborating, if not constructing, the feeling of a technical dignity. Are we suggesting that big data, artificial intelligence, digital imagery, data visualizations, and so on are actually the complex robe of the contemporary augur who continues to pass off flights of birds as signs of the future, except that he or she is now more credible because it is big data than flights of birds, and because he or she uses many devices and much computation to erect the altar of his or her own vaticination? This would be too harsh a judgment, even for a self-flagellating scholar, and hypercritical of the new methods of the humanities and social sciences. However, I am actually suggesting the opposite, namely that these devices and forms of computation are not always like the doctor's stethoscope. That is, they're not always functional in identifying symptoms that derive from causal connections in the real, but use the rhetorical force of the digital augmented sign to build an oral technicality around essentially indexical discursive elaboration, that is, signs that signify causes, but are not necessarily so. So it is time, in the 5 minutes left, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 1 hour, the whole morning. They're already suffering. Okay. Okay, let's suffer a little bit more, but a little bit less actually, by introducing a case study. Well, I concede a case study to you. On June the 17th, 2015, Alexander Morvintsev, Christopher Ola, and Mike Taika, the first and third software engineers, and the second an intern at Google, published a post entitled Inceptionism, Going Deeper into Neural Networks, in the company blog dedicated to AI. Then I have a long Marxist passage on corporate blogs, but I don't read it to you. The content of this post is well known to specialists. Automatic image classification and automatic verbal recognition have made great strides. To accomplish these tasks, mathematical models have been created that seem to work in the sense that they return increasingly satisfactory results. If I use an automatic translator between two languages that I know, for example, like Sanskrit and Farsi, I find that its work is most of the time very satisfactory. By the way, there is no automatic translation between Sanskrit and Farsi. The point, however, is that it is not entirely clear how this satisfactory result is achieved. The post is then essentially about some suggestions with respect to how one can reverse engineer such results, that is, try to understand from them how we worked the neural networks that produced them. The post focuses in particular on image recognition. I'm sorry, I'm relating very trivial stuff for those who work in the field, but I'm going to do it with another angle. The post focuses in particular on image recognition. You train an artificial neural network by exposing it to millions of examples and adjusting its parameters until it produces the desired results. That a neural network produces the expected results, however, is not completely satisfactory from a human perspective, because we also want to understand how they were obtained. That is, what kind of artificial cognitive pattern or scheme emerged from training the network. This is also crucial for us to be able to actually attribute human-like intelligence to the network, that is, to distinguish between a perfectly simulated intelligence and an intelligence that not only simulates the results of a natural intelligence, but obtains them by following a criterion that is analogous to those followed by a natural intelligence. I will not dwell on this philosophical aspect, which obviously refers back to the concept of the Turing test. The type of artificial neural network examined by the Google post typically consists of a millefeuille system in which there are 10 to 30 layers of networked neurons that progressively distill the final result. The system again seems to work, but it is not totally clear how the end result is achieved. In other words, the artificial neural network produces the distillate, and we know that what the still that produces it looks like, but it is not easy to determine which drops go through it. From the way this millefeuille system responds during training, it seems that it proceeds through a kind of generative pathway whereby the first deeper layers of the network are trained to respond with respect to the presence or absence of what semiotics would call plastic formants, while the more superficial layers would become sensitive to what Grimascian semiotics would call figures or objects that can be lexicalized. In other words, in face recognition, for instance, the first layers see edges or blunt corners, while the last ones recognize eyes and mouths. Then I have a long passage about how artificial intelligence generative path is actually different from the Grimascian one, but I don't read it, I spare it to you. According to the post then, one way to understand what happens in the transition between one layer of the artificial neural network and the next is to reverse the process and thus ask the neural network trained to recognize a certain type of images to start from an image full of visual noise and transform it until the neural network itself produces the desired effect. This is actually a well-known operation in art history, Gestalt theory, and perception theory, except that it has usually been accomplished in relation to human visual intelligence, starting from a blank sheet of paper, or better yet, from a chaos of unrelated dots. What strokes should I draw, or what dots should I join, so that the sense of a face emerges? One dot is too little, but two dots surmounting a horizontal line are perhaps already enough. And then I have another long passage, I don't remember about what, but similarly, the blog proposes to produce progressive adjustments to the image so that the inverted artificial neural network recognizes objects in it that it has been trained to recognize. One of the purposes of this procedure, according to the article, is that it can help identify and correct cognitive biases developed by the artificial neural network during its learning phase. The example proposed by the blog is often reported in the literature on the subject, is a very good example. since the artificial neural network was trained to recognize dumbbells from pictures that always showed them being lifted by muscular arms, the moment they have to produce one of these pictures using the same mechanism by which they identified them, they represent not dumbbells alone, but dumbbells with 4 arms. This reveals that although the network's result may be satisfactory because it actually recognizes a dumbbell in a picture every time we ask it to do so, in reality, the network is not recognizing the dumbbell alone, but rather a complex object composed of a dumbbell and a forearm. However, this invisible discrepancy can become visible in particular cases and manifest as an error that reveals the fact that, in fact, the network effectively identifies dumbbells in photos, but does not understand what a dumbbell is. And then I have a long passage about, well, again, it's not important. Similarly, artificial neural networks can that is actually nice. I'm not going to read it, but it is about how, as non-native speakers, we can pass for perfectly apt speakers, although we are making mistakes, and although we don't realize that we're making mistakes, and native speakers do not realize that we're making mistakes. So we are in a loop because our linguistic interaction is satisfactory, but we are making mistakes and we don't realize it, and our native speakers, interlocutors, do not realize it. You know, this is a little bit what is going on with artificial intelligence. Similarly, artificial neural networks can interact with humans satisfactorily when they have to recognize images, but when you ask them to produce images, you realize that the recording of what identified a certain object as such was satisfactory but partial, and therefore prone to error. A neural network that would be shown a dumbbell raised with teeth, for example, might not recognize it because its visual and semantic segmentation of the dumbbell includes, unlike the human one, the hand that raises it, although this does not transpire in most recognitions, precisely because the dumbbell that prototypically appears in photographs appears there jointly with a hand and a forearm. But what if, in this back engineering process, one does not submit to the artificial neural network a chaotic image, but any image, which the network will then have to modify in order to transform it into the image that would ideally produce the identification for which the network was trained. This is a very complicated way of describing what Deep Dream does. It is here that the technical procedure for identifying how the layers of artificial neural networks work begins to give rise to a visual rhetoric. Indeed, since the first layers of the network react to plastic formants, if these layers are asked to modify any image, they will tend to produce a version of it in which the same plastic formants are accentuated. The effect is that of a transformation of the image in an impressionist or post-impressionist sense, whose results in many cases are reminiscent of the style of the great masters of this current in the history of painting, Van Gogh, for instance. If we then act on the more superficial layers of the network, those deputed to the recognition of whole objects, then the end result will consist in a kind of artificial pareidolia. You have probably seen these images. If a neural network trained to recognize faces is presented with a photograph of clouds, the network will transform the image of the clouds so that we ourselves, human viewers, can recognize a face, actually many faces in it. This step is certainly interesting and the images produced intriguing, but this is where the slippage between the doctor of neural networks and the augur of artificial intelligence is triggered. Indeed, at a certain point, one gets the impression that the authors of the post lose the precise sense of what they're doing, which was trying to understand how the different layers of an artificial neural network trained to recognize the subject of a certain image worked, and essentially begin to fiddle with the network. The idea that you can discover interesting things by fiddling with the digital and in particular with artificial neural networks, is very popular. In fact, the ideological assumptions of this idea should be better explored, I believe. It would perhaps be foolhardy to claim that Newton, Galileo, all the way to Einstein and contemporary science fiddled with their devices and computation until they arrived, as if by serendipity, at a useful result. The attitude of science, and especially that of modern science, has always been, on the contrary, to favor a prior consideration for method, or at least to live in the illusion that a method could be somehow constructed. One, according to this ideology, does not discover things by fiddling, but by refining the method by which one investigates the reality studied. And that is an enormous difference between the Grimmasian model, which is a method-based model, and the artificial intelligence heuristics, which are entirely based on fiddling and playing. Semiotics, which attempts to emulate the scientific disciplines, seeks to do the same. The attitude manifested in the above-mentioned post, on the other hand, is much more characteristic of disciplines such as architecture or engineering, which, though based on scientific thinking, value the heuristic nature of doing, the doing. There is also a bigger ideological difference, I think, but well, I'm not going to talk about it. The problem, however, is that here this doing, this fiddling with neural networks by putting them upside down, so to speak, is first presented as a heuristic method of a meta-epistemological nature suitable for better understanding the inner workings of the networks, while later it is in fact adopted to produce knockout images, the heuristic value of which, however, is unclear. So we start basically with try to understand how neural networks work, and then all of a sudden there are these pretty images going around and, you know, turning into the basis of all sort of speculation with no scientific evidence whatsoever. So they are like the ogre's robe. They are put there to convey a sense of novelty, surprise, even eeriness or uncanniness, but they serve actually no purpose, or at least they do not serve the effort of understanding promised at the beginning of the post. They are a decoration, a beautiful digital decoration. In it, in fact, many different discursive genres mingle and fade into each other, contaminating each other. The authors present themselves as investigators of the heuristics of artificial neural networks, yet then go on to fiddle with their own experiment and in the end essentially close the blog as artists. So they started as scientists, they end up as artists. And in the middle, we actually completely lose the logic of their experiment. Reverse engineering artificial neural networks is interesting because it produces beautiful images. That's the conclusion. So two questions emerge at this point. The first, what is really intriguing, surprising, and fascinating about these images? So why should we really think that they are beautiful images? And the second, since they do not in fact say anything about the workings of the artificial neural networks that produce them, then someone must attribute purpose and meaning to them. And it is here that the second, more radical shift from technique to rhetoric emerges, because the humanities, and in this case especially cognitive psychology and art theory, volunteer to illustrate the revelation of these images. So basically, there are art historians and art theoreticians who run into Google laboratories to explain the scientific meaning of images that were created just playing around. It is necessary, first of all, to start with the tautological character of these visual experiments. The picture of clouds contains eyes because it has been retouched by an artificial neural network trained to recognize eyes. The most this visual experiment can reveal is how an image X must be transformed for it to appear to contain representations of an object Y. So far, this is really a total triviality. Why this triviality can become the starting point for bold speculations in both cognitive science and art theory is complex and falls into an area necessarily subject to interdisciplinary study, but maybe I have finished my time. So I will just jump to the conclusion. Yes. Yeah, I'll jump to the conclusion. And then we'll continue the self-flagellation together in another moment. So let me finish with an image. Let me finish with a paragraph. Until much of the 1990s, at least, no philosophy professor would have dreamed of showing pictures during lectures. At most, in some areas, such as aesthetics, 35mm slides were used. These were common especially among art historians who bought them from the museums of Europe or had them purchased through their university libraries or for the libraries. I still remember myself, buying slides from the Prado. A good art history department in Europe, still throughout the 1990s, had to be equipped with slide projectors. A personal anecdote: between July the 21st and July the 27th, 2002, I attended a congress of IAVIS, the International Association for Word and Image Studies in Hamburg, and I remember that still in 2002, the participants, among whom there were many art theorists and art historians, were still delighted to be able to use the same slide projector that had been used by Erwin Panofsky. Indeed, for a university lecturer in much of the 1990s who had wanted to add images to his or her verbal discourse, the possibilities were essentially slides, which were very popular precisely in the field of art theory, or transparencies, which on the other hand were used mainly by economists. I still remember the transparencies that my professor of political economy at the University of Siena, Maurizio Franzini, would pre-package and then complete while projecting them by means of the special device. Even Umberto Eco, when talking to his students about comic books or other images of popular culture in the 1980s and much of the 1990s, did not reproduce them, but describe them. Economic disciplines, earlier than others, actually introduced transparencies as a visualization aid to academic discourse, where the content displayed was mainly diagrams, that is, graphs. This practice was related to the world of business, where the presentation of diagrammatic images and especially graphs to support verbal discourse had become the practice, especially by means of whiteboards or panels. University lectures until much of the 1990s, on the other hand, were immersed in an essentially logocentric semiotic Umwelt, where they could also talk about film, television, contemporary art, and whatnot, but they did not show it, rather they described it, and in many cases merely evoked it. Then the first PowerPoint presentation from a computer-connected laptop took place in Paris on February 25, 1992, by Robert Gaskins, the program's principal creator. Here is a quotation about how Gaskins himself describes the event. I quote, 1992, "The very first public use of a laptop to project video from PowerPoint took place on February the 25th, 1992, at the Hotel Regina, beautiful hotel, in the Place des Pyramides, Paris, across from the Tuileries. With a laptop casually under my arm, I entered at the back of a ballroom filled with hundreds of Microsoft people from the European, Middle Eastern, and African subsidiaries. I walked through the audience carrying the laptop up to a podium at the front. There, I opened the laptop and plugged in a video cable on the lectern. I began delivering a presentation to introduce PowerPoint 3.0 for Windows, using PowerPoint 3.0 running on the laptop, feeding video out to a projector the size of a refrigerator, which put the video slides onto a huge screen behind me. No one had ever seen PowerPoint running on a portable computer before, let alone being used to produce a real-time video show in color with animated builds and transition. The audience, all Microsoft people who talk to customers frequently, grasped immediately what the future would bring for their own presentations. There was deafening applause." End of the quotation. Robert Gaskins had foreseen in the preparatory plans of PowerPoint that thanks to the spread of personal computers and with the gradual miniaturization of projectors, these presentations would move from large, specialized business meeting rooms to small rooms for business meetings. What could not yet be foreseen is instead ably described by Gaskins in a following passage of the same biographical note, and I will end with this quotation. "All this was predicted in my strategy documents from the mid-1980s. What was unexpected was that the same hardware would also extend PowerPoint use into university teaching, children's school reports and science fair projects, sermons in churches, supertitles for opera houses, and many other uses that its creators had never imagined. Thank you.